Brothers and sisters, we're very fortunate to have today with us Dr. Perviz Asaria. Could we welcome her forward with the salawat? Perviz is a mother, doctor, public health researcher, and a human being who supposedly has a microbiome. Inshallah, she's going to be talking to us today about Microbial Mizan. Salawat.
Sorry, just give me a moment to get the presentation up, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you all really for coming to listen to me. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I know I harass some of you from time to time with some of these thoughts, but it's a nice opportunity for me to put them all together. I want to talk to you about something that's not really my area of expertise, but that has profoundly changed the way I think about and the way I practice medicine over the last few years. As some of you know, I'm a medical doctor. I trained at Imperial College in the late 90s, early 2000s, which shows my age. At a time where the training was very conventional, we used to believe that eczema was a disease of the skin, that your skin barrier had broken down and you should put some cream on it in order to solve that, and that, the disease of the arteries was caused by blockage of the arteries closed off, and then you get a heart attack and you can solve that by stenting the problem, and that the lungs were the place where asthma occurred, and you could solve that by giving people inhalers. And this is the kind of model that we were brought up in. And I swallowed that really quite completely, and I didn't have any inclination to look outside or to look beyond that. But I think that in the past 5 or 10 years, there's new research which has been emerging, which completely changes the way that we look at these things and maybe takes us back to a more traditional model of balance within the human body, which we have let go of for a number of years, maybe a couple of 100 years. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. So I'm going to start really first with a passage which seems completely unrelated, and I just want you to do me the honor and bear with me to listen to it for a couple of minutes, and then I'll get to the main body of the talk. This is a picture from an article in The Guardian a couple of months ago, and it's an article written by a woman called Isabella Tree, who is a farmer who had been struggling. And she writes, "In 2000, my husband and I turned our 1,400-hectare farm in West Sussex over to extensive grazing using free-roaming herds of old English longhorn cattle, Tamworth pigs, Exmoor ponies, and red fallow deer as part of a rewilding project. For 17 years, we had struggled to make our conventional arable and dairy business profitable, but on heavy low-wheeled clay, we would never compete with farms on lighter soils. The decision turned our fortunes around. Now ecotourism, rental of post-agricultural buildings, and 75 tons a year of organic pasture-fed meat contribute to a profitable business. And since the animals live outside all year round with plenty to eat, they do not require supplementary feeding and rarely need to see the vet. The animals live in natural herds and they wander wherever they please. They wallow in streams and water meadows. They rest where they like. They disdain the open barns left for them as shelter, and they eat what they like. The cattle and the deer graze on wildflowers and grasses, but they also browse amongst the shrubs and trees. The prigs rootle for rhizomes and even dive for swan mussels in the ponds. The way they graze, puddle, and trample stimulates vegetation in different ways, which in turn creates opportunities for other species, including small mammals and birds. Crucially, because we don't dose them with avermectins, which are anti-worming agents, or antibiotics, their dung feeds earthworms, bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates such as dung beetles, which pull the manure down into the earth. And this is a vital process of ecosystem restoration, returning nutrients and structure to the soil. Letting the arable land lie fallow and returning it to graze pasture for a period, as farmers used to before artificial fertilizers and mechanization made continuous cropping possible, is the only way to reverse the soil loss that was happening. The key is to be organic and to keep livestock numbers low to prevent overgrazing. 20 years ago, our soils at the farm, severely degraded after decades of ploughing and chemical inputs, were almost biologically dead. Now we have fruiting fungi, orchids appearing amongst our former arable fields, an indication of the subterranean networks of mycorrhizal fungi that are spreading. We have 19 types of earthworm, keystone species responsible for aerating and rotivating and fertilizing and hydrating and even detoxifying the soil. We have found 23 species of dung beetle in a single cowpat, one of which, the violet door beetle, hasn't been seen in Sussex for 50 years. Birds that feed on insects attracted by this nutritious dung are rocketing. The rootling of the pigs provides opportunities for native flora and shrubs to germinate, including sallow, and this has given rise to the biggest colony of purple emperors in Britain, one of our rarest butterflies which lays its eggs on sallow leaves. I just want you to keep that image in the back of your mind as we proceed through this talk. So I'm going to start first with the story of penicillin. Some of you may be familiar with some of this. I certainly wasn't familiar with all of it. This here is a picture of a lady called Anne Miller, who was the first civilian to be treated with penicillin. And the man with the bow tie standing next to her is Sir Alexander Fleming. Now, Alexander Fleming was a Scottish physician who in the 1920s was based at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. And he was looking for ways to stop bacteria. So he used to take enzymes from saliva and other substances to see if he could use those substances to stop the growth of bacteria. And he would plate his bacteria onto a plate like this. So the stripes that you see across the plate are the bacteria, okay? And then he would put other substances onto that plate to see if he could inhibit the growth of bacteria. And in 1928, in August, he decided to take a holiday and go to France. And maybe because he was a man, he didn't tidy up his laboratory sufficiently before he went. And he came back a few weeks later, and this is something similar to what he saw. There was a fungus growing on his plate, okay? It was a fungus from a bread mold called Penicillium. And you can see that around that fungus, so around that white area, that the stripes of bacteria have stopped growing. So that white substance is producing something that kills bacteria. So initially he was quite excited by this discovery. He thought he could make something of it. And then he spent quite a lot of time trying to purify the substance in sufficient quantity so that it could be used. And he found that he actually couldn't make enough of it to make it useful. And eventually he gave the idea up, saying, okay, probably this is not clinically useful. Nice idea, but it didn't really work. Now, the sort of progress on from that was that eventually we arrive at the point where we get to the world wars, and particularly in the time of World War II. You know, in the time of the Crimean War, there were more deaths from infections than there were from actually war casualties. There were more deaths from pneumonia, more deaths from wound infections than people dying in the war. And with the outbreak of World War II, there was this impetus to try and find a way to stop these deaths that used to occur due to infections. And there were a couple of guys called Chain and Flory who read Alexander Fleming's paper, and tried to find extra funding in the USA in order to purify this substance to use it commercially. And they went to New York and they were rejected. You know, people thought this wasn't really a viable idea. And then they took their ideas to a laboratory which was involved in fermenting substances in Illinois. And those guys took them on and said, okay, come, we'll try and purify this. And they actually employed a lady called Mary to go and look in all the markets for all the molds that she could find to see if they could get a really good version of this mold that they could purify a large amount of penicillin from. And she scoured and scoured, but eventually a housewife turned up with a cantaloupe melon that she had bought, which was completely moldy. And that melon had an enormous amount of penicillin, much, much more than was contained in the mold that Alexander Fleming had got. And in fact, the penicillin we have today is a derivative of that original cantaloupe melon penicillin, okay? So this is the story of your penicillin. Now, just to show you how it transformed the lives of people, we go back one. So this lady, Ann Miller, she was a nurse in 1948, and she had a miscarriage, and then she suffered from what they used to call at that time childbirth fever. She got an infection after her miscarriage. And she slipped in and out of consciousness with incredibly high fevers for an entire month. And she was very, very close to death by the end of that, when her doctor managed to find just a teaspoonful of penicillin. And he gave it to her. And within 4 hours, her fever broke. And by the next day, she was better. And she lived to 90 years old, and she passed away in 1999. Okay? So this was almost, at that time, really a miraculous cure, you know. And people at that time were actually trying to preserve the urine of patients who had taken penicillin and re-extract the penicillin that had already been used in one cycle, because it was such a precious ingredient. You know, just remember, this is a time where you could have a scratch on your face, okay? It could become inflamed, then your eye could become inflamed, the infection could spread to your brain, and you could die as a result of a very, very small scratch, okay? And women used to die after childbirth because of this type of an infection. And so this sort of advent of antibiotics it really felt like it was miraculous. It was transformative. And of course, penicillin wasn't the only one. It was the first one, but there were others after that, which really completely changed the way that we view our world and the way that we treat people. And we started to use it left, right, and center for everything, you know. It seemed to have very little in the way of side effects. Maybe you would get a little bit of diarrhea, a bit of a runny tummy, but nothing really significant. And it used to effect a miraculous cure on most things. And we happily, clappily used it as we pleased. It also kind of fit with the mood of the time. You know, suddenly we had recognized these germs around us, and we wanted to fight with them. There was a war on germs, like there is a war on terror. It was this kind of thinking of wiping it out, disinfect it, make it clean, get rid of it, and then we will get over the problem and we will be healthy. So I want to ask you in this room, for example, can you put up your hand if you've never had a course of antibiotics? Anyone in the room who's never had any antibiotics? Okay, excellent. That's a rare find. Okay. Anyone who's had less than 5 courses in their lifetime? All right, okay, not bad, okay. 5 to 10 courses? Okay. Who thinks they may have had more than 10 courses of antibiotics in their lifetime? Okay. So nowadays, a child born nowadays will receive an average of 17 courses of antibiotics before the age of 20, okay? And it doesn't stop there. By the time you get to 40, you've received at least 30 courses of antibiotics. And as a doctor, the antibiotics we use are what we call broad spectrum. They don't just knock out one bug, they knock out lots of bugs, you know, which for doctors is very reassuring. The patient comes to you, they've got some kind of infection, you don't know what the bug is. By the time you take the bug, you send it to the laboratory, you grow it, you know, it's going to be 3 days down the line, they could be much sicker by then. Just give them penicillin, okay? It will kill a whole host of bugs, okay? You've saved yourself, you've saved the patient, okay? You've done everybody a favor, and actually you don't have to worry exactly what it was that caused the problem in the first place. So it's a kind of nice, reassuring substance for a doctor to use. Sorry. So now I want to ask you a second series of questions, okay? So those of you who are above 60 in the room, you can do this, apply this to yourself, okay? And those who are under 60, okay, pick an adult who is 60 who you know, okay? So those of you who are 60 and over, in your parents' generation and in your grandparents' generation, can I ask you to put up your hand if you know anyone with asthma in those generations? Okay, one, okay? Anyone with nut allergies in those generations? In the sort of 80 to 100, 100 plus, or may have passed away category. Anybody know anyone with nut allergy? With autism? Okay. With ulcerative colitis? In generations above, so people over 60. Okay, one, okay. Crohn's disease? Multiple sclerosis? Gastritis? Reflux disease? More common? One? Okay, all right, okay. So now think about your own generation and your children and your grandchildren, okay. Anybody know anyone with asthma? Okay. With eczema? Nut allergy? Autism? Ulcerative colitis? Crohn's? MS? Gastritis? Stomach problems? Reflux? Okay. So I think that you can see that there has been a sea change in the kind of diseases that we are dealing with. And we used to say that this is, you know, we used to say, oh, we have chronic diseases now, heart disease and cancer. Maybe it's because people are living longer and they get old. And because they get old, they get these diseases. We never used to live to this age before, and that's why we never had to contend with these things. But I put it to you that some of these conditions are not diseases of the old, right? Asthma, eczema, nut allergy, autism, they are not confined to elderly people, okay? These are diseases of the younger and the newer generation. They are chronic diseases which our children are having to cope with. So what is the link with all of these diseases? You know, we were always taught in medical school that these are separate conditions, right? They're separate conditions. They've got nothing to do with each other. Each bit is a mechanical problem which is broken down in one way, and we need to fix it by looking at it individually. And I think that the link between all of these diseases, okay, the ones I put in black, the link is very definite, and the ones I put in blue, the link is putative. There is some evidence that it's there, is that there is inflammation and a dysregulation of the way your immune system behaves in all of these conditions, okay? And this is the thing that underlies all of these problems. So your immune system is there to actually tell your body what to fight and what not to fight, and to behave in an orderly fashion, to behave in a fashion that is appropriate and sensible, to react in a way that is appropriate and sensible. And I think that we have now an epidemic of diseases which are based on a dysregulation of the immune system. So the question is why? Why is this occurring? Okay, why has it become so widespread? What has happened which has changed in order to shift our burden of disease in this direction? And what has it got to do with the microbiome? What is the microbiome anyway? So I want to tell you that we are perhaps only 10% human in the way we are composed. That for every cell that you have, which is a human cell, you have 10 which are bacterial cells. And we know to a certain extent about this. We know that our hands are covered in bacteria. But there are places that we used to be taught in medical school that were completely sterile, which are clearly not completely sterile. We were always told that the stomach was so full of acid that no bug could ever survive. There was nothing in the stomach, right? And actually the stomach, the intestine, the colon, okay, and particularly the colon, are full of trillions and trillions of bacterial cells, okay? Our lungs are full of bacteria. Our hands, our skin, you know, every passage that you can think of in your body is full of bacteria, and those bacterial cells outnumber you 10 to 1, okay? So what are these doing there? I mean, isn't that disgusting? Should we just get rid of them? Why don't we just clean them all out? Why don't we disinfect ourselves better and just get rid of it? This is the kind of approach that we've had thus far. You know, just get rid of it. Just clean it out and get rid of it. So I want to make the point, perhaps in the most, not the most pleasant way, but in a way perhaps that will remain with you quite, perhaps for a long time. So this is a public toilet, okay? And we all imagine that the best time to go to a public toilet is when it has just been cleaned down with bleach, okay? But I'm going to put it to you like this, that actually when the public toilet has been sat on by a number of people, it is colonized with skin bacteria, okay? And the skin bacteria are taking up all the space, okay? And other bacteria, like from the stool, don't really have much space to climb onto that toilet and take hold there. When you disinfect that toilet, okay, and wipe away all the normal bacteria that are there, okay, and then you flush the toilet, and flushing, in fact, unfortunately, is the act that aerosolizes all that bacteria, okay, the first bacteria that are going to settle on that toilet surface, okay, are going to be the bacteria from the stool. So perhaps the most dirty time to go to the toilet is after it has been wiped down with a disinfectant, okay? Or the one that maybe should make our stomach turn most is at that point in time. So is it just that we are colonized with bacteria, they are taking up all the space, okay? And therefore the bad bacteria that cause us infection cannot actually get into us, and you know, the good bacteria just sitting there, taking up all the space, and all the bad bacteria that can cause infection not taking, are unable to get a grip. They don't have any real estate that they can kind of land on and get a fix on. I mean, to the certain extent, that is the case. That is the case. You know, that just the sheer numbers of the bacteria we have are actually useful in keeping out the pathogens, as we call them. But I want to put it to you that actually they are doing a lot more than that. So, I mean, I want to bring some familiar examples from other places in the animal kingdom, and we can see that they actually often things live in a mutually beneficial relationship with each other. This is a very familiar picture where this bird is picking off flies from the back of the zebra, okay? The zebra is benefiting and the bird is benefiting, okay? This is on a macro level, you can see it, okay? And then you can say, okay, you can go to the next level, okay? Very familiar example again for us, okay? Cows, and none of us in fact, have the ability to break down grass. You need a specific enzyme called cellulase. And it's not that cows have that enzyme in their body, it is that the cows harbor bacteria, the bacteria sit in that stomach, and those bacteria help the cow to break down the grass, okay? This is how the system works. The cow feeds the bacteria lots of nutrients, and the nutrients and the bacteria release nutrients for the cow. So both of them are benefiting from this relationship. Okay. This is a more kind of rare example. This is a Hawaiian bobtail squid, okay? It has an area where it stores bacteria, which when they metabolize, they produce light. And the squid uses this light so that when it is dark and there is light shining from above, it produces its own light. So you can see that it does not cast a shadow like other animals do, and this helps it to camouflage itself from predators, and therefore it is not attacked, okay? And there are hundreds and thousands of these examples in the animal world, hundreds of them. Literally every species has bacteria living on it, which are not just taking up space, but are serving a useful function, both for themselves and for the host that they are residing on. So the thing with the bacteria in our gut is that they live in quite inhospitable conditions. You know, some of them don't metabolize oxygen. There isn't very much oxygen down there. Some of them are, you know, living in nooks and crannies, which until now we haven't been able to grow them, because once you take them out and put them in the normal environment, we're not able to characterize these organisms. But now with the advent of DNA sequencing, we can see that there are actually a lot more bacteria there, and that they are doing things that we never realized that they were doing, okay? So these are just a few of the things that they are doing, just to give you an example. And every day, every week, something new is published about what they are doing, okay? They're helping you extract calories from food, calories which you would not be able to extract without those bacteria present, okay? They're making vitamins. For example, vitamin K is the vitamin that clots your blood. We do not make that vitamin ourselves. Our bacteria make it for us, okay? We need those bacteria to make that vitamin, okay? The other thing that they're doing, which is really quite a critically important function, is they create this layer of mucus on top of the cells of the gut, okay? And they keep those cells of the gut tight so that things that are in your gut do not get into your bloodstream, okay? So those are the kinds of functions that these bacteria are performing. That's what they're up to. Now, the more weird and wonderful thing is that they are actually calibrating our immune systems, telling us how aggressively we should be reacting to things, okay? And they're talking to our brain and other organs. And when I first heard this, I thought this was ridiculous and a complete load of nonsense. But I would like to show you a few studies, maybe, which might convince you that I'm not talking complete nonsense. So I want to start with a common problem, being overweight, obese, okay? Okay, another survey, okay? You can embarrassedly put up your hand very quietly if you don't want to be very explicit about this. I just want to ask, who in this room thinks that being overweight or obese is a result of being lazy and eating too much? That overweight people probably eat a little bit more than they need, and they sit in front of the TV a bit longer than they really should. They don't do as much as they should. They're not exercising enough. Who thinks that? All right. Who thinks people who are obese because of their genes? All right. Okay, so some people think it's genetic and laziness, combination of genes and laziness. Okay. Who thinks it's because their metabolism is slow? Okay. All right. Okay. Who knows any overweight people who don't actually eat more than the average person? Okay. Who knows overweight people who don't sit in front of the TV? I mean, they seem to do as much, perhaps, or more than other people around them. Okay. So I think that the question of obesity or being overweight is not as simple as we have made it to be, okay? And I think farmers have recognized this for a long time. Okay? Farmers give animals antibiotics in order for them to gain weight more quickly and fatten them better for slaughter. And it's a cheap intervention which works really well. And it used to be very widespread, and in 2006 the EU outlawed it here, but they still do it by saying that their animals are kind of slightly ill and giving them a little bit of low-dose antibiotic. Interestingly, if you give children antibiotics before the age of 6 months, there is a higher chance, I'm not saying that they will, but there is a higher chance that they will be overweight in later life, okay? Then there's some interesting observations that people who are overweight or obese have different bacteria in their guts, or a different balance of the bacteria in their guts to people who are thin. Okay. So then the question is this bacteria changing because of what they're eating? You know, clearly they're overweight, they're eating pizza and chips all the time, and their bacteria have changed, and therefore this is a problem. So to test this, actually, what scientists have done is they've taken the bacteria from obese people and from thin people, okay, and they've given them to mice, okay. And the way they breed these mice is they breed them in very sterile conditions. They don't allow any germs to come into contact with them. The mice are birthed by cesarean section. They're fed food which is steam sterilized, so they're in a completely germ-free environment, and a very bizarre mice, okay. And when you give these mice bacteria from fat people versus bacteria from thin people, the bacteria from fat people makes the mice fat, okay? Even if you can do it in two ways. You can allow the mice to eat whatever they want, okay? But you can also restrict the food intake so that both sets of mice have the same amount of food, and the bacteria from the fat people will still make the mice fat, even though they're eating the same amount of food. So clearly, they are able to extract more calories from that food, okay, than the bacteria from the thin people. The other interesting examples that we see occurring in nature, for example, there are birds which migrate, which double, triple, quadruple their body weight before their migration, okay? And then by the time they finish migrating, their body weight returns back to normal. Okay, so you say, okay, this is normal, this is what, you know, you'd store up the fat, you'd migrate, and then you'd return. So interestingly, if you put those birds into captivity, so you don't let them migrate, okay, but the seasons changed in the same way, those birds which are in captivity, not only do they put on the weight the way that their fellows who are not in captivity do, but they also naturally lose the weight without ever having expended that energy in migrating. They haven't traveled thousands of miles, but they've still lost the weight. Similarly, women, when they get pregnant, okay, put on more weight than the weight of the baby and the amniotic fluid, okay? And interestingly, if you take bacteria from a woman who is in the 3rd trimester, so towards the end of her pregnancy, versus a woman who is in the 1st trimester of the pregnancy, and give it to germ-free mice, okay, the mice put on different amounts of weight. The mice who received bacteria from the woman who's in the last part of her pregnancy put on more weight than the mice receiving bacteria from the woman who is in the first part of the pregnancy. So clearly these bacteria are doing more than just sitting there in your gut. They're doing something more in terms of energy extraction, and the balance of bacteria is important in how people's body shape arises. So, okay, you say this is gut, you know, we're talking about gut bacteria, this is all in the gut. I mean, this doesn't explain anything else, right? You know, bacteria sitting in the gut, they extract more energy. Okay, I can just about accept that. That's kind of normal, okay? What about things like asthma? How are bacteria in your gut related to asthma? How is it possible that there is anything to do with asthma with the bacteria that are sitting in the gut? So I want to just start by telling you that children who are born by cesarean section are more likely to have asthma than children who are born normally, okay? Mothers who have had antibiotics in the year preceding their pregnancy, or during their pregnancy, or during the labor, or children who have antibiotics in the first 3 months after birth, okay, are more likely to develop asthma later on than children who haven't, okay? It's a really bizarre phenomenon. What could possibly explain that? I'm sure some of you have heard of a bacterium called H. pylori. Maybe some of you have been tested for it, okay? This is the bacteria that they test for when you go to see your doctor and you say, I've got a bit of gastric trouble. He says, oh, you might have an ulcer. We used to think ulcers were caused by stress, but now we know that they are caused by H. pylori. I will test you for it. If it's there, we will eradicate it. We'll give you some penicillin and a couple of other drugs, and we'll get rid of it for you. Interestingly, people who have H. pylori are much less likely to get asthma than people who don't have H. pylori, okay? H. pylori is a very interesting bug because it lives in a very acidic environment of the stomach, okay? And it does cause ulcers, and it can cause stomach cancer, right? But it doesn't do so in everybody. And H. pylori produces some enzymes which neutralize the acid around it, so it becomes, it is able to survive. And it also produces something that gets through the mucus of the stomach so that it can actually get to the wall of the stomach. And the more aggressive that H. pylori is, okay, the more likely you are to get an ulcer. But also, the more aggressive that H. pylori is, the less likely you are to get asthma, okay? And it appears that actually H. pylori stimulates some cells within your immune system which are called regulatory cells, okay? They are the cells of the immune system which say, calm down, mate, calm down. There is no need to overreact to this problem, okay? And in fact, if you take those regulatory cells from mice who have H. pylori and put them into other mice, okay, so you've just taken the cells, you haven't taken the H. pylori, okay, and then you try and give the new mice asthma by making them breathe really disgusting bad air, right? Those who have those regulatory cells are less likely to get asthma than those who don't have the regulatory cells. So these regulatory cells are playing a role in calming things down in your immune system. And this is the theory, or part of the theory, about why people who have had a lot of antibiotic exposure may be more prone to getting asthma. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons which may be playing a part in their asthma. I want to make the point, actually, that how does this relate to having a C-section birth or having had antibiotics in the mother? The point is that actually all of us get our microbial inheritance from our mothers, right? Okay. And when we are born, we take the bacteria from our mothers, okay? If we are born by C-section, the bacteria that we get are the bacteria of the hospital environment around us. So you can identify whether a baby was born naturally or by C-section just by looking at how similar their bacteria are to their mother's bacteria. And interestingly, the mother's bacteria changes in the last trimester of pregnancy such that she produces a lot of lactobacilli, okay? Lactobacilli are milk-chewing bacteria. So basically, you are giving your child the bacteria which allows them to digest milk. They're able to digest the milk. So this is really an incredible thing. The second thing that's very interesting is that women produce in their milk, 40% of their milk is composed of a substance which human beings can't digest called oligosaccharide, right? Why would God create a system where you're spending so much energy producing milk in which 40% of it cannot be digested? And it's interesting that actually there is a bacteria that lives in the lower part of your gut called a bifidobacteria, which digests exactly that substance which is produced in breast milk. And when a child receives breast milk, that bacteria is stimulated to grow and take over that area of the colon. And that bacteria is very specific in increasing the colonic integrity. So it produces mucus, it tightens up the colon, so actually it creates that barrier between yourself and the outside. And this is promoted by the action of giving breast milk to your child, okay? And it's interesting that these allergic diseases are more common in bottle-fed babies and in babies that are born by C-section. And another sort of piece of evidence that ties into this is that actually people have tried to prevent some of these diseases by giving women beneficial bacteria during pregnancy and giving children beneficial bacteria once they are born. And you can, in fact, reverse part of your propensity towards diseases like asthma by doing this. There's good evidence to show that you can actually reverse this by having beneficial bacteria. There isn't as yet evidence for asthma or for nut allergy. Now, it's unclear whether we're not using the right bacteria in order to get that reversal, or whether it's that at that developmental stage, your immune system has been misprogrammed and you then cannot go and reprogram it at a later date. It's unclear what the problem is there. It's not yet been done for those diseases. So the final example that I want to share with you, which really for me is just went from the gut to the lungs, but actually there is a lot of evidence emerging that your gut bacteria actually control the way you think, the way you feel, and there's a kind of a very strong connection between your gut and your brain. It's not just your gut feeling, okay? So there is, for example, sort of simple example of these mice which are sort of genetically gregarious versus mice which are, known to be quite anxious. And actually, if you breed both of these varieties germ-free, and then you take the germs from the opposite group and you mix up the germs, so you've given the anxious mice the gregarious bacteria, and the gregarious mice the anxious bacteria, their behavior completely changes. And it lines up more with the bacteria than with their natural disposition. And to take that example one step further, okay, it's not just the bacteria. It's never that simple. It's not just the bacteria. So you need the anxiety, you need the situation that provokes the stress, but the bacteria have a very, very significant role in that. So this is a slightly more complicated slide, and it's the last one which I want to take you through, okay? So the gray mouse pair is a normal mother mouse and her baby, okay? And the red ones are the germ-free mice, okay? The mice which haven't got any bacteria in them whatsoever. And if you take the babies away from these mothers, okay, you create a situation of stress, okay? And you activate all the stress hormones just like you would in a human being. So there is this environment of hormones which are stressed out, okay? But also, the gut bacteria change. As a result of the stress, the gut bacteria change, okay? And if you have changed gut bacteria and stress hormones, you get anxious behavior, okay? Now, if you take those altered gut bacteria from that mouse which has been stressed out, okay, and you put it into a germ-free mouse which has also been stressed out, okay. So interestingly, the germ-free mouse, okay, which has been stressed out by being separated from its child, it doesn't behave in an anxious manner. You can measure all these hormones which are elevated, okay. It should be anxious, okay, but its behavior is not anxious, okay. Once you put the bacteria, the abnormal bacteria, back into that mouse, it starts to behave in an anxious manner, okay. Now, if you take the gut bacteria from the anxious mouse, okay, and put it into a germ-free mouse who hasn't been stressed out, okay, it doesn't behave in an anxious manner. So you need both the anxious hormones or the situation of anxiety, okay, but also the bacteria. So you need the two things in order for the behavior to become anxious, okay. So it's not the bacteria alone, but if you take the bacteria out, if you wipe that bacteria out, the mouse does not behave in an anxious manner. And I find this fascinating, right? It's really like profound that the way we behave is so profoundly influenced by what is going on in our gut. So the bugs we have really, or the bugs we host, or the bugs we harbor, the ones we live with, okay, depend on the ones that we make the environment comfortable for. You may have heard recently that they found bugs which chew up plastic. We know bugs which live in sulfur. We know that bugs that live really deep inside the sea, ones that fix nitrogen, live in the most inhospitable environments which make life possible in those environments, really quite incredible. And the bugs which live inside you and I are dependent on the environment that we make possible for them. It's the same on every level. Like if you or I go to the National Gallery and it's full of sort of people who don't really look like us, and there's lots of artwork which doesn't represent us, and there's no halal food, and there's nowhere to pray, and people look at you when you're walking with a hijab, you're not going to survive there very long, right? And if you go there and everything is kind of in tune with what you need, and there's somebody has thought about a space for prayer, and the right food is available, and everybody's welcoming you, and other people are making room for you, you're going to survive. It's the same kind of phenomenon with the bugs that we have in our guts, they depend on the environment that we are providing for them and how much stress we put them under. How many times have we knocked them out with antibiotics, unintentionally thinking that we were doing a good thing? Are we feeding them the stuff that they need to grow and multiply, right? These are the things that affect the balance of the bugs within our guts. And I want to put it to you that actually these are things which have co-evolved with us, right? They are our friends and our neighbors, and they determine how good we feel, and we determine how good they feel. And I want to bring you back to that initial passage which I read to you about how we cultivate this balance. In the medical literature, unfortunately, there's always a bullet solution to these things. They have this I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a big thing at the moment. Fecal transplants, probiotics, prebiotics. They always want to take a capsule, okay, and treat the problem by giving you a capsule. And actually, often you find that the capsule isn't enough. It's the whole ecosystem which is important. And often we see that the ecosystem, or the things that we see in the nature outside us, are patterns which are repeated within ourselves. And I think that just being aware of the need for this balance is the first step for us to right some of these really quite profound problems which are impacting on us and our children in such a dramatic way, which we did not see 50, 100, 200 years ago. I will stop there and I let you ask questions if you have questions.
Do we have any questions?
Just a quick question on the thing you said about the breast milk and the anxiety that the baby could have, or the mouse, that's what you're referring to. So my question is on if the mother or the child or baby hasn't had the breast milk, could that also affect the fact that the person might be on the spectrum? Could that cause that at all? Could they be much more anxious or whatever?
Are you talking about the autistic spectrum? Yeah. Okay, so a lot of this research is new, and I'm not an expert in it. Okay, from what I've read, that it's often the case that people on the autistic spectrum have different gut bacteria or different balance of gut bacteria to people who are not on the autistic spectrum. And interestingly, people who are on the autistic spectrum often suffer from very clear manifestations of gut issues such as constipation or diarrhea. Okay? The specific question of whether breastfeeding ameliorates that or causes it or doesn't cause it, I don't know. I haven't looked into, and I don't know if there's any evidence one way or another. But it is clear that breastfeeding stimulates a certain group of bacteria which formula milk cannot stimulate because it does not have the same oligosaccharides, it does not have the same sugars in it, right? So, I mean, eventually, babies born by C-section and babies born naturally, their bacteria, after a period of months or years, they converge, okay? And eventually, breastfed and non-breastfed babies, if you follow them up for a long enough time, okay, the bacteria settle down to something that is similar to each other. The question is that in that very specific developmental phase, while you are training your immune system, okay, have you done damage which is potentially not reversible, either by giving antibiotics or by giving the wrong food and stimulating the wrong group of bacteria?
Any more questions?
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned about, the increase of allergy in children because of a more sterile environment. Do you think that allergy can be reversed in a child if we look into the microbiome of a child? I'm not talking about eating a pill. I'm not talking about eating a probiotic every day. But I'm talking about giving a different diet, for example, probiotics, prebiotics. I'm talking about fresh fruit and veg. I'm talking about the likes of kimchi, sauerkraut, things like that. Will things like that help to reverse allergy in a child, or is an allergy something that is not reversible?
Okay, so the one where we have very specific evidence is eczema, okay, and the probability of getting eczema, okay, and it is very clear that there is good evidence that if you give probiotics to a mother and improve her diet, and you give probiotics to the child, you reduce the incidence of eczema, okay? And eczema is an allergic disease just like asthma is and just like nut allergy. I used to think eczema was my eldest child had eczema. I would take him to the doctor and they would say, you're not putting enough moisturizer, put more moisture. He should be slippery, he should be slipping out of your hand. That's why he's got eczema, right? There was no understanding that this is a disease which does not originate in your skin. This is a disease that has its source somewhere very different, okay? And there is a lot of evidence that if you change the bacterial composition, that you change your propensity to eczema. I think that this, now I don't have any evidence for this, I think that this is also going to be possible in the other allergic diseases, but it has not been shown as yet, And is that because we're using the wrong bacteria, okay? Or is that because it's irreversible? I suspect to a certain extent it's because we're using the wrong bacteria. We're using the wrong bacteria. We haven't figured out exactly what needs to be done, And you're right, actually, in general, creating a better environment, a better bacterial environment, okay, for the bacteria that you are co-living with is probably, in my opinion, likely to be beneficial, right? I can't say in you or me or in my kid or your kid, is that going to reverse the allergy? I don't know, but I think it's worth a try, right?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you for your talk. I found it to be quite like an eloquent way of relating, looking at a system and looking at the systems we live in general to something very personal. So you got me thinking about a lot of other things other than just the biology. But although I was getting a bit stressed out about talking about mice being stressed out, being removed from their mothers, but I had a kind of like a question regarding where you touched on the certainty with which scientific institutions declared certain medical knowledge to be, canon at certain points through history. I guess I want to know your thoughts on whether that's sort of like, why do you think, what kind of attitude is in those institutions that caused that to be the case at that time?
So I want to tackle this in two ways. One is to say that actually medicine or our medical practice is a product of the time. We were fighting war on this and fighting war on that and war on germs. And we saw germs, we were fighting a war on germs, And also, in the sort of late 1900s, as we industrialized, we began to see things in a mechanistic way. And also as we developed things like instruments, before people used to go by what the patient told them. That was the only instrument you had, that was the only way, and maybe you'd feel for one or two things. You didn't really have any way of seeing any further. You develop the stethoscope, suddenly you hear something. You develop the ECG, now you see a line. Now you're driven by what does this line mean? Is the line changes? I should be treating that? Your whole view of what you're seeing is to some extent driven by the instruments that you have within you, and to some extent driven by the structure around you, right? Everything is mechanical, we can control everything, pipes block up, electricity flows like this, okay? We start applying that kind of model to the human body, and that's the way we, even this, a lot of this stuff is emerging because we can sequence DNA now, and we can see bacteria that we never used to see, and part of this is really a product of that change in medicine. But I think that all traditional systems of medicine had this concept, you know, Ayurvedic and Chinese and many others had this concept of a body being out of balance, and trying to restore that balance. And we completely lost that, I think, in the last century. It is completely gone. And actually, for me, this has been really quite profound in bringing home to me how much wisdom that we have within our own sort of practice and tradition, which I hadn't really neither paid much attention to nor taken very seriously. You know, I've always prayed and fasted, but I haven't really taken other things very seriously, for example. So we kind of, you know, I don't know, I can't quote you exactly the hadith, but so first we have this, the al-ma'idatu baytud da, that the source of all illness is in the food that you eat that day, okay? Or sufficient morsels, a couple of morsels of food are sufficient for a man, but if he has to, he should fill his stomach 1/3 with food, 1/3 with water, and 1/3 with air, okay? Or had it not been a difficulty for you, I would have prescribed for you that you brush your teeth before making wudu in every, you know. I mean, how many of us take all these things seriously, you know? There's a very, very clear connection with poor oral health and heart disease. Not just infections of the heart, but actually, you know, blockages of the heart, okay? What about the sunnah of the Prophet, to wash your hands, okay? To wash your hands. When I was looking at this again recently we were trying to do a talk for the children in madrasa, the sunnah is actually to wash your hands and not to dry them before you eat. How clever is that? You know, you wash your hands and then you don't dry them on a towel which is full of everybody else's bugs and has been for the last, you know, all of these things which I took very lightly and almost I didn't know really. This kind of thinking has made me reassess the wisdom in these things to a level that, you know, we can't take our understanding of the world from a community that doesn't wash after going to the toilet and doesn't wash his hands before eating food, right? There's something fundamentally wrong in the way that medicine has been practiced, and we need to look at it differently.
Just as a quick follow-up, if I may, you mentioned one of the reasons for thinking that some of the conditions that are afflicting younger people, such as nut allergies, asthma, that the link could be drawn. Arguably, a skeptic might say, you know, our medical knowledge has improved, therefore, you know, these diagnoses have become apparent to us, and in that way justify, I guess they are justifying that that's the case. Does this show that even sort of like in this contemporary time, science is becoming a bit more political?
Does it show that science is becoming more political?
Or more politicized?
Is your question whether these things could just be a better recognition, or is your question, is science becoming more political? I'm missing the...
My question is the scientific environment, so the scientific practice, the way that it's practiced, is it being used almost like still used as a battleground for pushing political ideas? You know, someone might have a scientific idea about how something should be, vested interests, and then using that to justify a particular medical stance.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely always the case. Clearly, I'm doing it here to justify my stance on how the world looks. It's always a case, right? It's always a case. You can't escape from that. And you know, research funding, everything follows somebody else's scientific, sort of political interest, or where they think they're going to make money, etc. You can't, you know, there is no science in a neutral space or outside of the context that, you know, outside of the wider context. There isn't any getting away from that, I think.
I will take one final question. Ali?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your talk. So on the one hand, we've heard about how public health measures, washing your hands, penicillin, antibiotics have had a positive effect on the modern world. As we know, one of the most positive effects that anything has ever had on mankind. On the other hand, we're hearing that despite our lower perinatal mortality and everyone surviving more, we're getting possibly more diseases, even if we account for recall bias and advanced modern medicine diagnosing better. So this balance of too little bacteria, too much bacteria. So in practice, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I'm not going to say we get rid of penicillin. You know, there are some illnesses which are life-threatening. Okay, and really, it's been a profound transformation at that point to have antibiotics. Okay, there are many illnesses which are not life-threatening. Okay, which are self-limiting and which do not need antibiotics, and which will make you feel miserable for a week or two, but they do not need antibiotics, okay? And we have to stop using antibiotics for those. We have to stop using antibiotics for those. We have to try, as far as we can, to avoid antibiotics during pregnancy and peripartum, you know. I give you a very clear example. Group B strep is something that we screen for in this country in pregnant women, and then if they have it, they get antibiotics. And I've been in this situation myself, okay? You get antibiotics. Your chance of having a child who has an infection and dies from group B strep, okay, who gets an infection, forget dies, gets an infection from group B strep, is less than 1 in 200. You have to treat 200 women with antibiotics for one of them to prevent their child getting group B strep, okay? You know, you don't want to put any child at risk, okay? But there are now studies being done where they are giving probiotics to women to try and balance out the bacteria in order to not have to use antibiotics, right? And there's a very good study actually, not for group B strep, but in India, where they randomized two groups of women in the community, in an Indian context, in a rural Indian context, okay, to receiving probiotics and not receiving probiotics for neonatal sepsis, so sepsis in children in the first 30 days of their lives. And those women who had got probiotics for their children had a much lower rate of sepsis in their children, right? There are other ways to tackle these problems. We need to think about them. We need to think about them.
As a follow-up,
yeah.
That sleep and physical contact, for example, when the baby is very young,
yeah.
Hugging, cuddling.
Yeah.
So cuddling when the baby's young,
yeah.
that affects immune system and gut microbiome. And the second one is sleep, because I've seen things about sleep, but not sure.
I haven't looked specifically into hugging and cuddling and how it affects the gut microbiome. I'm sure it does, okay? That's the closest contact that a neonate doesn't have that much bacteria. Interestingly, you can give a neonate blood transfusion from any blood group, I think, and they should survive because they haven't yet developed their immune system sufficiently to fight that. So neonates are different in that way, and they're in the process of acquiring bacteria, so I'm sure if you hug and cuddle them, they will, but I don't have any specific. I have come across stuff that says disruption of your circadian rhythm will disrupt your gut bacteria. So this is another way, you know, antibiotics are one way of disrupting your gut bacteria, okay? Not sleeping enough or sleeping randomly or staying up till 2 a.m. every day, that's another way of disturbing it, right? Eating the wrong food is another way of disturbing it, etc., etc. There are many ways to disturb that balance.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there. Salwat.